Hey y'all, it's 6:09 a.m., just turned 6:09 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, May 12th, and 2023, so they say. And geez, I think technically summer started a couple of days ago here. Maybe if it's different for you where you're at, but I'm in like West Central Michigan. The wettest place on Earth that isn't actually underwater. And also, the temperatures, they can be extreme as the weather. I don't know if it's because I noticed we were starting to miss spring and fall a lot more back when I lived in Northwest Indiana. But this year, basically, it seemed like winter was a little bit half-hearted, but still, it was still a decent winter. And then it was winter, and then the trees started budding, and it was still winter. Like, I think it snowed a little bit, like a week or so ago. And then it was summer. Then it was like, I think I need to install the air conditioners. Happened that fast. I feel cheated. So, if it's kind of the same way where you're at, let me know, because I've been wondering. I actually, unless I'm delusional, I remember having a spring and a fall way back when. Maybe I'm just being nostalgic. I don't know. So what I wanted to do today is share the first passage in the New Testament that made me kind of a little bit concerned. It made me a little bit concerned about what was being said in the New Testament. I really, at the point in time that I remembered reading this and reflecting on it and thinking, yeah, that's not right. That doesn't match the Old Testament. This had to be like 2012, 2013. And I know it's a long time ago. It's a long time. It's 10 years ago now. Why did I wait such a long time to actually commit? Well, because just like with the Old Testament, there are various authors of the books and all that. And I didn't know a lot. And I try to approach just about anything. If it's a difficult subject, and Bible subjects or difficult subjects in general, I try to approach it like this. Hey, I may not know everything about what's going on here. There are things that I'm probably missing. I probably don't have the full picture. So maybe I should just wait, delay my judgment. There's that. And unfortunately, I do have to admit that I, like so many others, I quite liked the cap, I suppose, that the New Testament brought to the entire story of the Old. And I think the reason that I liked it so much, in part, is because my understanding of the Old Testament had been shaped for the most part for years by preachers who were compelling me to essentially view what the Old Testament was saying through the lens of the New Testament, not by itself without being influenced by this New Testament thought, and certainly not on my own. I just didn't, I didn't ever read it and think about it apart from all of the, because look, with most people, they hit you when you're very young, They like VBS and they have you memorize all those verses about how much Jesus loves you. And little children, and most little children that I know are good-hearted. They want to, as opposed to John Calvin's total depravity. I mean, most children I know, especially little children, pretty good-hearted. They're selfish. In a lot of ways. They don't like pain, and they like pleasure. They like fun foods, and they like doing things they like doing. That's true. But in general, children are far more good-natured before all of the elements of the world chew them up enough times, and they become very hardened. And sometimes their worst characteristics sort of come to the forefront. They take these little impressionable minds, and in their minds, they absolutely marry together the ideas of the New Testament with the Old Testament. And they keep reinforcing this as you get older in Sunday school, for children's Sunday school, and up to adult Sunday school, and the home groups that a lot of these places now have. It's all about the home groups, and the people who are entrusted with leading the home group typically go off the script that is approved by the church they go to. So it's constant reinforcing, compelling most people to. They're not reading and thinking about this apart from what they've been essentially forced to, the ways they've been forced to look at it. It's very difficult to break that programming. And, anybody can attest to this, whether you're hanging on to the ideas of the New Testament or not. And remember, it took me a very, very long time to become honest enough to where I could make a clean break of something that I saw as being extraordinarily problematic. Very long time, many years. So you have to admit, these things, that they're very difficult to extricate yourself from, and to separate the ideas that you've been taught to inject into the Old Testament from the New Testament. I mean, oftentimes this sort of programming is so strong that we don't even really pay attention. If we read on our own, and most people I know don't really read much on their own. I mean, up until a certain point, about 10 years ago, reading the Old Testament, so boring to me. It was so boring and bland. It sucked. Actually, when I first started reading it on my own in my 20s, my early 20s, I had some time there where I was separated from kind of everybody, no church or anything like that, and I started reading the Bible on my own. And I'd pretty much, by that time, I'd kind of, not entirely forgotten, but a lot of that programming from the time I was little, it faded a lot. It wasn't in the forefront of my mind. And I was enthralled. I was enthralled at that point of time. And then, of course, the wise guidance in my life says you should go to get in a church so that they can reprogram you in how to look at this. You're far too excited about this, and you maybe not seeing it the right way. Of course, that's hyperbole, and nobody directly said that, but that's essentially what happened in my 20s. So then it took a lot of years to try to clean all that garbage that went on for many years after that out of my head. and start reading the Bible again in a very purist way. I don't care what anybody has taught me about it, what they want me to think of it. But even then, these things that they really infuse in your mind and your emotions, especially when you're little, they hang on. They hang on really hard for a very long time. And it's really tough to break away from that. So, this is actually the passage. It's in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. And of course, anybody who's familiar with the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, knows this is the faith chapter. Now, when I read this, I'd already read it before. I'd heard it multiple times, people talk about it. And I was at the time in the habit of reading the Old Testament, and then I'd pop into the New and read some of that. Now, it's true that I was still seeing the way I had been programmed to see it all. But when I got to Hebrews 11, I remember I read it a couple of times, and I had time to sit and think about it. And when I thought about it, some of these stories that they actually go over, they were still fresh in my mind. And I thought, this doesn't match up. And of course, the next thing I thought was, maybe I'm just missing something. Maybe I just don't understand how this works, because definitely what they're saying does not match up to what I've read about these people in the Old Testament. So I'm going to go through a bit of Hebrews chapter 11 to explain to you what my issues were and what they still are, even more so now. Now, I will admit to you, the beginning of it does bother me a bit, because I never really I did understand. People would say, well, this is what it's getting at. And then in the first verse it says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Yeah, I guess. A little bit sophisticated, the language, but okay, I get it. So faith, this thing that the whole chapter in a lot of the New Testament is telling us, it's good, we have to have. This involves believing in things that there's no tangible evidence for. And if that's the case, that just doesn't really line up with what we see in the Old Testament. It does not. In the Old Testament, when the God of the Old Testament, when Yahweh interacts with people, typically, he really doesn't expect somebody to just go off of his word. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong or whatever, but typically he does tend to do things and show them things beforehand. They've got something to go on. This is real. This is tangible. I was spoken to by the Almighty. Whatever we're talking about, there was something very tangible there. It wasn't that you were expected to believe in something that had zero good evidence for. So it was the first thing that was like, faith. Okay. And of course, modern Christianity really stretches the meaning and application of faith out pretty hard. Now, some of these characters that are actually mentioned, we talk about their faith, not out of line necessarily, think he starts out with, see, that's a little weird to me. Verse 3, through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. For me, that's a little bit more of that sophistry, and I don't quite get that. But we could argue that Abel, by faith, brought a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. We could argue that. I mean, yeah, I don't think that's a stretch. We could probably argue in verse 5 that by faith Enoch was translated, that he should not see death and was not found, so on and so forth. Sure. I mean, not a big stretch. Not a stretch. Noah. Okay. Because, if we go back to Genesis chapter 6, he's told that these things are going to happen, and he's told what to do, and he's explained what to make, and all of this stuff, and you could probably argue that, hey, if Noah didn't have any faith, he wouldn't have done that, maybe. But I thought he was picked because he was righteous, which would mean that he had faith already. But still, you could argue it, probably. Now, Abraham. So it says, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should have to receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing where he went. Kind of. You could kind of say that. Maybe that's true. He knew he was going to Canaan, and in fact, it was Abram's father, Nahor, that brought the family, it says, to the Canaan, the area near Canaan. It wasn't Abraham, it was his father. So they were pretty near Canaan, and then he was told to leave his father's house and to go into Canaan. And, he was a sojourner and a stranger, and so were his descendants for some time between Canaan and Mitzrayim, not Egypt. So, maybe, absolutely. Okay, and then it goes on how, by faith, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob wandered in that land, so on and so forth, being sure of the promise. Sure. I mean, you read the story of Isaac, I don't know how much faith Isaac had to have. I mean, look, there's some issues. Now, I'm not saying that Abraham in particular, when, for instance, let's say when Yahweh is telling Abraham's grandson Jacob how righteous Abraham was, he said, he was righteous because he kept my laws, my statutes, my judgments, okay? But Abraham did have a little bit of faltering. He was told when he was 75 and he went into Canaan that he was going to father a son by Sarah, and that through this son he was going to make a great nation out of him through this son, Isaac, which we don't know his name until he's born. Okay? But the thing is, right after he gets to Canaan, a little while after Canaan, it says there was a famine. Maybe it's a famine. R-O-B is the word used, Rob. And then he has to go to Mitzrayim, not Egypt. And he tells his wife, who at the time her name was Cherie, and then it becomes Shireh. He tells her, look, do me a favor, when we get there, tell anybody who asks, you're my sister, because if they know you're my wife, they may try to kill me to take you, because he was a foreigner. This is my assumption. He was a foreigner, And it would have been seen like, who is he to us? We'll kill him. We'll take his wife, probably everything else he had. He figured he was walking on eggshells. But here's the thing. If he had great faith, you do have to wonder, he was told he was going to father a child through Sarah, who was going to become, a great nation. So these are kind of strange behaviors for somebody who we're supposed to look at as extraordinarily faithful, as opposed to maybe a regular guy who some pretty outstanding things were done through. This one probably pretty regular guy in a lot of ways was made into a bona fide nation. Through his single son, through Sarah, they only had one child together. And then Isaac had 2 children. Those children had a lot of children. Anyways. But not long after this, you see, there's this whole debacle with this Pharaoh. It actually be this Peroa, who seems to be he is called the King Melech Mitzrayim, but they always have that title. That works with a lot of other nations. They always have a certain title, like the Philistines always have these Sarens, SRN, Sarens. It's just, I guess, kind of a thing. So there's this whole debacle. He takes Sarah, doesn't kill Abraham because she says she's his sister, which she was, his half-sister. He gives her back, and she comes back with at least one handmaid, this Agar, or Hagar. They transliterate it as. So they kind of get impatient, and Sarah says, well, look, you can you have sex with my handmaid, Agar. I don't know if she had a say in it. You would think. You'd hope. But, probably, even, I would say that she probably did, and she was probably very willing, because still, I'm saying Abram's a regular guy, but, he was a pretty well-to-do regular guy, okay? He had over 1,000 just servants, in the sense, not like waiting on him and bringing him tea, but that helped him, obviously, with all of his flocks, his herds, and everything. And he was I guarantee you, he was a hell of a big operation moving from place to place. Don't kid yourself. So anyways, yeah, I would think she'd be happy to bear the child of somebody who was as prominent as him, going from being pretty much a servant in the house of this Melech Mitzrayim, Peroa. It was probably a huge step up to have the child of this guy. That probably was a bad idea. That probably was a really bad idea, because he was told sometime before that he was going to have a child through Sarah. That was going to be the one who was going to inherit this whole land of Canaan. Probably not a great idea. I don't know what he was thinking, but you might not want to count that as faith. And the thing is, because he chose to do that, that created some problems for this Agar, this girl, and her child Ishmael, or Ishmael, as they transliterate it. They had problems and hardships because of that. So, you could argue, oh yes, they were faithful, but and the thing is, it just in the text, there's problems. There's problems with Abraham. There's problems with Isaac. Seemed kind of like a pretty self-absorbed guy. Jacob as well, for a good deal of his life, until he hit he hit a wall where he got backed into a corner pretty bad. And his world shrank pretty hard, before he started having any kind of faith or decency about him, Jacob. Seemed like he definitely took the easy way, and he paid for it pretty hard for a long time. Seems that way, from the way the Bible's translated, it does. So, until maybe later in his life, it's hard to really argue that Jacob was faithful. Okay? And then they go on in verse 11, through faith Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Does anyone remember what happened with Sarah? I'll change this to the KJV Plus so I can quickly reference these names. Oh, they're not going to show it to me. They're just going to show it to me in Greek. I guess I'm going to have to do this by memory. See if I can select Genesis without screwing up my... Oh, they got me in Exodus. Go back. Anyways, it's Genesis, 18. And it says that 3 men come to visit Abraham, and they say that Yahweh is one of them. And of course, as everyone knows, that's a picture of the Trinity. I'm just fucking with you. So it says Yahweh and 2 other men, they come to visit Abram briefly before these 2 other men, these malach, which they call angels, go to Sodom to see Lot. But the thing is, now Yahweh reiterates to Abraham at the time when they stop to see him, he's going to father a son through Sarah. And she's nearby. She hears this. What does Sarah do? Does she fall to her knees and thank God in faith? No. Sarah actually laughs. Oh, you think she's laughing for joy? I don't think so. Because actually, of course, Yahweh knew she laughed, and he reprimanded her for laughing. What kind of a laugh was it? It was a bullshit laugh. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to have a child. It wasn't faith. And in general, I think it's not here, because I can go back to verse 11. No, it's not here. It would be elsewhere. And I'm going to say it was probably, looks like Romans, or maybe Peter, who talks about her, that she was so respectful calling Abram Lord. Now, I don't remember any of those times that she did, but if she did, I just don't really see it out of a great deal of respect. When Sarah passed, she was far younger. Abram would have been 138. Sarah dies at 123, as per the text. And she's nowhere near him. And I don't think she had lived near him for a long time. She doesn't, and, given the attitude, how she treats Eger after she tells Abraham to impregnate her, Eger, she treats her like shit. Yeah, I know Eger got a little bit of a chip on her shoulder. But read and pay attention. Sarah does not seem like a spring of virtue and faithfulness and humility. Absolutely not. Just think whatever you want about that. But I certainly don't think that she qualifies as being all that faithful. Okay. Now, then we have a little bit of this propaganda that we also see in the book of Galatians. And this might be one of the reasons why people claim that the author of this book is Paul, or a Pauline author, since about half of the Pauline books seem to be a person very different than the other half. Now, some people could say that's age and prudence and stuff, and maybe. However, he does tend to announce himself very clearly at the beginning of his letters. So he says that, let's get to the land here. Well, yeah, verse 13, he said, all these died in faith, speaking of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not having receiving the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. No, they were strangers and pilgrims specifically in the land regarded as Canaan, the borders of which are actually articulated in Genesis chapter 10. And then in Mitzrayim, same thing. That's where they were strangers. Not on the earth. Not on the earth. Eretze, in the land of. Not on the earth. This is the propaganda. And I'll read on because they lay it on thicker. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. What kind of country, author of Hebrews? And truly, if they had been mindful of that country, which they inserted country, from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, again is inserted, that is an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city, obviously a heavenly city. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. I'm not so sure about that, and I did a little bit on that, but it didn't have to do necessarily with the offering him up, but I'm not sure about that at all. That by faith he was going to kill his son. And he that hath, because I think that actually is that whole part of forcing the Old Testament to work through a New Testament lens. And he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. See there? Of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Correct. Accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure, which is true. I'm just not so sure that that's what he was being asked to do, but we'll move on. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Not so. That's not really. I mean, how? Faith, like, is in him giving him them blessings? Maybe. But that whole story is just so full of some seedy stuff. So we'll leave that just for a minute. So by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed both the sons of Joseph and worshipped leaning upon his staff. I don't remember that worship, but he did. He blessed the sons of Joseph. In fact, he made them, Ephraim and Manasseh, he basically put them in the place of his first three sons that were born to him as far as their inheritance would go. And it was really interesting because they actually did become far stronger than those sons. His first three sons were, of course, Reuben and Simeon and Levi. But faith, maybe. We're going to say maybe, but they say by faith Joseph, when he died, made mention of the parting of the children of Israel and gave commandments concerning his bones. Now that we can read in Exodus that he wanted his bones, his remains, or whatever, brought into the land of Canaan and buried there. Why would he care if they say that these patriarchs were all looking forward to a heavenly domain, not an earthly domain? Why would he care where his bones were buried? He wanted his bones taken back to Canaan, the land that was promised to his great-grandfather, Abram, then Isaac, and Jacob. Why would he care if he was looking forward to only some sort of heavenly domain? Now, I don't completely get this whole thing by faith. Moses, when he was born, he hid 3 months of his parents because they saw he was a proper child. The Exodus account actually tells us the reason they hid him was because Pharaoh had put out commands that all of these male children of the Hebrews were to be killed. I don't know how that has to do with faith. That has to do with preservation. They wanted to preserve him. He goes on to say, by faith Moses, when he was come to of years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. I don't recall that in the text. That could be completely made up and we'd never know. They say, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. I don't know that that's the case either. It says that when he was 40, he went out of the palace to visit his brethren, and he got himself into a mess because he saw a Mitzri that was beating, you know the story, right? A Mitzri is beating an Obarim, or Hebrew, and he killed the Mitzri, and that just set off a big series of problems, and he ran off, and the rest is, I guess, history. By faith, I'm not seeing any of this by faith. Yeah. Again, he said, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Now the thing is, when he was sent back into Mitzrayim in Exodus 3, he is shown signs at Horeb by Yahweh. He's shown signs. He's told very clearly, I'll be with you. He's shown signs in his hand and his staff and all that stuff, according to the text as we have it translated. He's also told that he was also told that he can have Aaron speak for him to Peroah, his brother. Why? I guess he was so faithful that he argued with Yahweh and said, I'm not a good speaker. I can't do this. I'm not a good speaker. Was it his faith that caused him to literally argue with Yahweh? Say, I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't even speak well. To where Yahweh, a little bit pissed off, says, fine, I'll have your brother do it. Then they try to sell us faith. Israel went into the Red Sea as opposed to the entire Mitzri army behind them. It's faith. That caused the very faithless generation of Israelites, who were all, by the way, kept in the wilderness till they all died. And then Jericho and Rahab. And this is one of my favorite parts. This is the part that really fishhooked me, okay? Hebrews 11:32. And what more shall I say? Or what shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and of the prophets. Now, on a few of these accounts, yeah, some of the prophets really were stand-up people, faithful stand-up people. Barak, does anyone remember the story of Barak? He wouldn't go and fight with this king and against his captain Sisera if Deborah didn't come with him. That's faith. You're telling me that's faith? Gideon didn't believe what the Melech Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, told him that he was going to do. Why? Because he says, look, when he's even approached, he's like, I'm not from a prominent family. We're not strong in the tribe of Manasseh. We're one of the least people, and I'm one of the least in my family. That's not faith. How many fleeces did Gideon ask for? Now he beggingly apologized. 3. You remember the fleeces? Dew on the ground, not on the fleece. Dew on the fleece, not on the ground. You remember that? That's faith? That's faith. But all that aside, and we could talk about David, Jephthah, not so bad. Jephthah had a pretty, he had a pretty decent trajectory there. Jephthah was a tough story. In a sense, an enjoyable story, because, Jephthah really, really appreciated his history. Jephthah didn't need faith because Jephthah had his history. Not a history that somebody had falsified, faked, changed. He had very solid history of this people that he was able to relay to the kings of Ammon, or Ammon, to tell them, you don't have any claim to this land that we're living in. So faith, if he had faith, and maybe he did, it was based on a hell of a lot of evidence, is the point. It wasn't a substance of things not seen. It wasn't evidence of anything hoped for. It was pretty solid. He was operating on real solid evidence. Now, the thing is, you could contrast that to a lot of people that we read about throughout the Old Testament, who they do really have that, and maybe it had been a long time since Yahweh had really done much of anything in Israel like it is today. Really. We're living in some tough times today. It's dark, and there doesn't seem to be a lot going on. It's tough. It is. But there have been, if you just pay attention to the text of the Old Testament, there were times, long periods of time, when he didn't appear to be doing anything in Israel or maybe anywhere else. There were a lot of people who maybe chose to act against what they should have understood as very clear, solid history that just kept multiplying as time went on, in fact. But the one that really got me, this is the one that definitely made me take a step back and say, whoa, wait a second. Wait 1 second. You're trying to sell me as a pillar of faith. Samson. You mean to try to tell me Samson makes what a lot of theologians call the Faith Hall of Fame. The Faith Hall of Fame. You mean to tell me that Samson is making the list in the Faith Hall of Fame? Now, don't get me wrong. Samson is one of the most enthralling, bizarre, amazingly bizarre, and kind of astonishing stories that we see in the book of Judges, or the entirety of the Old Testament. It's definitely up there because it is crazy. If he did even near the things as the way that they're translated and brought to us, it's still an insanely astonishing story of what happened with this guy. Hands down, it is still a story I will go back to over and over again because it's so amazing and wild what happened. This guy was a human killing machine. It's what he was. That's what he was. Like no one I've read about, period, even like David's mighty men and his special elite 30 men who were really, really kind of amazing people and warriors specifically. Nobody holds a candle, as we understand the way the Old Testament's translated. Nobody holds a candle to the kind of killing this Samson did. Not even close. Specifically, I didn't even think he ever killed anyone but a Philistine. And he killed so many, it just boggles the mind. Okay? It's really one of the standout stories in the book of Judges, which is just, it's so sad. You have these enormously standout stories in the book of Judges. Why? Well, because I think a lot of things went radically downhill when Israel clamored for a king. They had to have a king. Up until then, it was a completely different system of government. And I believe it was fertile soil for things like this to happen. Gideon, Deborah, Baruch, Samson, Jephthah. And I mean, we could just go on because I can't remember the name of the guy who killed the king of Moab with the dagger he had hid. amazing stories, right? Because there was fertile ground for it all. And out of all the amazing stories in Judges, crazy stories, some of them, Samson definitely still stands out. But faith? No. I don't think I bring the word faith into one line of that entire story. Faith. No, not faith. Now, what you could argue for is that Samson's parents had faith. They did have faith. You see, when his parents were barren, his mother was barren, his parents sought out Yahweh to remedy that. That's faith in a sense. But of course, his parents had all of that history that their people had endured seeing these amazing wonders, having a direct relationship with the Almighty. They didn't so much need faith, they knew his capacity. So they sought him out. It seems to me like that's the sensible thing to do, but you could argue they had faith. Samson, though, we got some problems. And we got some problems with him being regarded as faithful necessarily. Certainly by the way that the text presents him. But just consider, for instance, there's early on in his life, this should be somewhere in the neighborhood of Judges 14, and if I go there and start reading through it, this will take an enormous amount of time, so I'm just going to relay it to you. You can check my work. Judges, I think it's chapter 14. He tells them, I want you to get me a woman. I got my eye on a woman who's a Philistine woman. I want you to get her for me. I want to take her as my bride. And his parents are upset. They're very upset. And they ask him, they say, is there not a woman among all the tribes of your people? Isn't there a woman amongst them? Because his parents were probably wise enough to see that this is frickin' trouble. This is not going to go well. I don't think there was as much an ethnic issue, though that is part of the law, if you want to check. Deuteronomy, let's say what? Deuteronomy 30 or 32. You can see Israel was to remain a distinct people, ethnologically, so they were told to marry other Israelites. Yes, to limit the gene pool, which is very much the opposite of what the wisdom of today, our rulers of today, want to tell us to do. They want to tell us you need to go away from your gene pool, which I say actually causes more problems. Samson's parents knew that was going to cause problems. Just culturally, there was going to be problems. Not to mention what kind of problems it could cause whatever children they had for the children, by the way. Coming from these two distinctly different cultures who did not get along very well. And when they ask him that, because they're distraught, then the narrator tells us what his parents didn't understand was that Yahweh was using this to seek an occasion against the Philistines. Yeah. So Samson, wanting these Philistine women, was exactly the occasion that Yahweh was going to use to kick major ass. That's what it comes down to. This has nothing to do with Samson's faith. It has everything to do with Samson's desire. And it just gets worse from there. For Samson. And for the Philistines. It gets better for Israel. Not right away. Not right away. Because at this point in time, the Philistines actually were ruling over Israel, definitely Judah, definitely Dan, but Israel in general. So, one thing after the other, it really leads into this nightmarish killing spree. Samson not only kills just this amazing amount of Philistine men, able-bodied men, he destroys so much of their property, burns crops. I mean, really something. None of it by faith. None of it by faith. The riddle he tells his prospective in-laws is to get one over on them, to enrich himself, not faith. Him coming back and finding out, well, let's say him killing a lot of Philistines because they cajoled his new Philistine wife into telling them the answer to the riddle, and all the men he killed over that, not faith. All the people he kills when he finds out that they killed his wife and new father-in-law, not faith. All of the burning of all of the crops and all of the destruction he wrought, not faith. These were acts of faith. And when you think about it, every other act after that, this guy knows that he is imbued or empowered, infused with this great amount of power that he can exercise. So all acts after that, do we have to argue that they're evidence of things not seen or substances of things hoped for? Or are they actions of someone who knows they have a certain degree of great power, so they do these great and horrific things? Even the very end, when he gets involved with Delilah, this, I don't know, was she a whore? I'm not sure. It just says a woman from this valley of Sorek, right? And she gets his secret out of him, and she sells him down the river to the Philistines. They put his eyes out. They put him to some sort of hard labor. Now it says that his hair begins to grow again, and he senses that his strength is coming back. And so the narrative says when they bring him into this, they say it's a temple of Dagon to make sport of him. He realizes he might have a shot at exercising all of that great strength again, which he didn't need any faith to know that it's a very good possibility that he can exercise this strength again, maybe one more time. So it's a weird temple, don't you think? Because it sounds like a stadium. And the text said there's these columns that support the whole thing, the roof. You don't want to see a stadium's roof collapse. That could maybe kill everybody. Are they columns? Maybe. But these members, he knows that these two are holding up the entirety of the structure. This is probably high engineering, not backwater dumb shits on the Gaza Strip. No offense to anybody from the Gaza Strip. But, you know, they give us the impression that the further you go back, the stupider people were. More primitive people were. Sounds to me like high engineering. When you can design a place that seats tens of thousands, that has a huge roof that could kill everybody if it came down, but it's all suspended very well by these two supporting members, whatever, columns or something. So he asks this boy who's leading him out, and maybe they had already done this plenty of times, made sport of him, because the Philistines certainly would have had quite a hate-on for Samson. But he knows his strength is coming back pretty good, so he figures he's got a pretty good chance of killing more Philistines at this point in time in one fell swoop than he did throughout his entire life, and he had killed thousands and thousands of them. So, for anybody who doesn't remember the story, he asks Yahweh to please give him the great strength that he had become accustomed to throughout his life one more time, so that he could kill all of these Philistines. For what? For the glory of Yahweh? No. He specifically says, over the matter of his eyes. And if you want to count that as great faith, I think you're confused. And I'm not saying all of these things to sit in judgment per se of Samson, though I regard his life as one of the great tragedies. One of the great tragedies of the Old Testament. And there were tragedies recorded. Some great tragedies recorded. And his was one. What a tragedy. But, you know, that would lead us into some ideas regarding symbionts. A symbiotic relationship between people's own desires, for good or for bad, and the way that the text describes Yahweh using those desires, no matter who it is, for his own purposes, whether their desires be good and unselfish, or, like in the case of Samson, pretty much always self-serving desires. The text tells us, the third-person narrator tells us, that all these things would happen so that Yahweh could pick a fight. And he delivers Israel through Samson. By the way, Yahweh uses Samson as his agent to deliver Israel. But I argue that there was no faith on the part of Samson that factored into every amazing thing that was done. I mean, there was the one story where he was seeing a whore, a Philistine whore, in one of their towns, and he heard that there was a number of Philistines. They caught on to him being there. He had a thing for these Philistine girls, Samson did. And he found out that they were plotting to try to kill him. And, excuse me for being so blunt, but go and read, check it out. He fucked their shit up. Big time. That's what Samson did. But not by faith. He had power. He had real demonstrable power that he was very well aware of. Now he used it to satisfy his own ends. Yahweh used it to fulfill his ends. And in all of it, I don't see a shred of faith from Samson. And at that, I'm almost at an hour. And so I hope I've demonstrated to you one of my earliest memories of having some serious issues with what I see being pushed in the New Testament as compared to what I witness being told to me in the Old Testament. Having said all of that, I would appreciate if anyone would please visit my store. There are some good items of clothing and other things that I've put various graphics on that I designed myself. Anything you buy, I get somewhere in the neighborhood of 20-30% SRP. So really, it does help me quite a bit. I've got some work being done to the website. It's still not done. It might take a little time. But by the time it's done, it will be a place where it's a bit more coherent and that's a good thing. Always work being done on the Bible versus Middle East, the book that I'm working on. And a lot of good strides are being made for anybody who wants to be on a mailing list. I'm going to get a little bit of a list together and then start sending out regular updates on things. Just send me a message at my inbox, john@oberyproject.info. Just put in the subject you want to be on the mailing list. I'm going to put you on a list. It's not going to be one of those things where you're going to be getting some people, their mailing lists, they're annoying. But you will be getting, like, for instance, if I have products that might help me to continue doing the work that I do, that if you will purchase them, that's great. I have various ways that you can donate to me, and I very much appreciate it. Very, very much appreciate my current patrons who either donate to me through Patreon or directly through Venmo, PayPal. I have links for these things, or Facebook Pay, all of that stuff. So once again, thank you for joining me, and I will see you again very soon, probably very, very soon, with another episode of the Obery Hours, where we continue our study in air. Is it mountain or is it not? So I'll see you then. Take care.